The ACT Party will be opposing this bill at the committee stages, but I would like to start by acknowledging that there was a proposal that the three bills that to be discussed today should have been debated together. And while the Honourable Leanne Dalzell referred to the fact that she would have preferred and Labor would have preferred for those bills to be discussed together, let me put on the record, sir, that it was the ACT Party, certainly was the party or one of the parties who objected to that. And we see a very big difference, particularly in the Electoral Finance Bill they're talking about and the Electoral Referendum Bill, although there are some issues that relate to both bills. I think the first point that we'd like to make is we would like to congratulate the National Party and Simon Power, the Honourable Simon Power, on this bill, on this Electoral Finance Bill. Let's acknowledge that absolutely up front, because the provisions of this bill are a very, very far cry, Mr Chair, from the Labor Party's original Electoral Finance Bill. And let's not forget the history of the Electoral Finance Bill, because I noticed that Leanne Dalzell was happy to talk about the 2005 unpleasant election campaign. I'll come back to the 2005 unpleasant election campaign later. But the genesis, sir, of this bill was the moves by the Labor Party prior to the last election to put in place a new regime on electoral finance and the conduct of elections. And let's forget the fact, Mr Chair, that one of the fundamental provisions of the original Electoral Finance Bill, when it went out into the public for submission, was a requirement that any single person or organisation, other than a candidate or a political party, if they wanted to speak out in opposition to any other political candidate before they so much as spent a single dollar, they had to sign a certificate before a Justice of the Peace. That's hard to comprehend, but that's exactly what the politicians, the Labor politicians in this Parliament, prior to the 2008 election voted for when they voted for the first reading of the then Labor government's Electoral Finance Bill. And they said to the people of New Zealand, if you want to have any right to free speech, if you want to have any right to participate in the election, you must make a submission. Because we, the Labor government, are saying, as a very minimum, we want you to sign a certificate before a Justice of the Peace, sir. And there was a very significant demonstration of objection to that bill. And, sir, and I'm reminded by the Minister of Police, Honourable Judith Collins, that she was there marching down Queen Street with me, sir, when I was simply a member of the public speaking out an issue that was very important to me, sir, and many, many other New Zealanders. And so let's look at some of the provisions of this bill and contrast it with what the Labor government proposed to do, or in actual fact did, Mr Speaker. And I should acknowledge that as a result of that widespread public opposition, the requirement to sign a certificate before a Justice of the Peace before you so much as spent a single dollar, so that was modified, and I think the limit was increased to $5,000. So the bill as passed wasn't as bad as promoted, but certainly when it was put out there in the public for discussion, that was the contempt, the complete and utter contempt that the Labor government treated the people of New Zealand with when they first promoted their bill. Sir, the Electoral Finance Bill, as passed prior to the last election, had a regulatory period, or regulated period, Mr Speaker, that applied from the 1st of January. And in practical purposes, sir, that could have been 10 or 11 months. We all know now that the election was in November of 2008, and it put restrictions on New Zealanders to speak out and to criticise the government at the time for 10 and a half months. And one of the significant changes, sir, that is provided for in this bill is that regulated period will be approximately 3 months or thereabouts. And so that is a very significant change. However, what this bill does, sir, do is it still carries across the provisions from the Labor government's Electoral Finance Bill that restrict the rights of ordinary New Zealanders to participate in the election by limiting what so-called third parties can spend. Now, we heard from Leanne Dalzell this afternoon when she talked about the vast sums of money. In her second reading speech, she talked about paid speech. She talked about how people can actually go out and spend their own money and buy advertising. Mr. Chair,
I call the Honourable John Boscawen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sir, let's put those restrictions in context. What this bill seeks to do is to restrict the right of ordinary New Zealanders, either by themselves or as in organisations, to spend no more than $300,000 running a campaign or being involved in an election campaign, sir. $300,000 of a third party, an organisation, and so I don't care whether it's the Brethren, the Catholics, the St John's Ambulance, the Family First, the CTU, the engineers trade union, sir. It restricts the right, sir, of those individuals to spend no more than $300,000 of their own money. But let's put that in context, sir. A political party, the two major political parties under this bill and their candidates are able to spend more than $5 million. In fact, about $5.5 million. And ordinary New Zealanders are being restricted to spending less than 1/16th, Mr. Chair, of what political parties reserve for themselves the right to spend. I noticed, sir, that the Leanne Dalziel talked about the very, very unpleasant election campaign from 2005. Well, she may have unpleasant memories of 2005, Mr. Chair. I also have my own unpleasant memories. And I recall, as I'm sure many New Zealanders do, the very condescending remarks of the then Prime Minister Helen Clark as she looked down her nose on national television during the final debate of the election campaign and said, "Goodbye, Mr. Hyde. Goodbye, Mr. Hyde," because she was trying to tell New Zealanders that the ACT Party was beaten for all money and wouldn't be returning to Parliament. And Mr. Hyde proved Prime Minister Helen Clark and a lot of other members of the Labour Party how very, very wrong she was, sir. Leanne Dalziel talks about the perception that vast sums of money can influence an election. Vast sums of money. And so once again I put that $300,000 limit, sir, in the context of what we, the politicians, the political parties, reserve for us to be able to spend ourselves. We're happy to pass legislation. Today we are passing legislation that will increase what a political party can spend. Actually increase it. There's a formula, sir, that's currently set down in legislation that allows a political party to spend just over $1 million plus $20,000 for every electorate in which it stands a candidate. And that formula is being increased to $1,030,000 plus $25,000 per electorate it stands a candidate. And so for the National and Labour parties, with their broadcasting allocation, that will take it to some $5.5 million, sir. And so later on in this debate, I'll be moving supplementary audit papers to increase those limits, and I look forward to discussing those, sir, later in the debate. Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by summarising what I've said in this particular section. The ACT Party strongly opposes the restrictions on third parties, and certainly a restriction, sir, that is only $300,000 or 1/16th, less than 1/16th of what the major political parties retain for themselves the right to spend. Thank you, Mr. Chair.